We'll take some questions from the students from Galgotias University. Set up this India Today Conclave pop-up in Mumbai. Thank you very much, Ian Bremmer, for joining us here.
I'm delighted and I'm honored. It's a great event and I'm really pleased that you put it together.
I must tell everyone watching, whether you're here in person or watching online or on television, a little bit about Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer is arguably the world's foremost expert on geopolitical risk. What that essentially means is if you run a country or if you run a company and you have no clue about what may happen next, you're looking for really sharp insights beyond what's visible on the surface, he's the guy to go to. We'll take some questions from the students from Galgotias University. This gentleman has his hand up. Yeah, go on.
A very pleasant evening, sir. I'm Devansh, law student from Galgotias University. So carrying on to what you said, sir, that Ukraine might get split this year. So as far as I know, this was one of the problems that you mentioned in top 10 problems for the world to face in this year. Now, since we're in the midway of this year, sir, and we have seen multiple things that have changed, is there any change that you think might happen, and what would be its effect on India diplomatically in its global relation with the West and with the Russia as well?
Yeah, I mean, so far the last 6 months have gone about as we expected in our top risk piece. Ukraine's counteroffensive had not gone well. They are now losing momentum because the Americans dithered for 6 months in the decision to provide ammunition that the Ukrainians needed. Also because the Ukrainians are running short of manpower and mobilization, especially trained soldiers, and because there just isn't enough air defense to allow the Ukrainians to ensure that they can keep the Russians from destroying their cities. This is why the Ukrainians are getting more desperate. It's why they're hitting targets inside Russia. It's why they're calling for boots on the ground from NATO. I do think going forward that the outcome for Ukraine is looking worse and worse. And it's possible that the Russians might be able to win the war in Ukraine. But this doesn't mean that Russia is going to be stronger globally. NATO will be stronger. The good news, and it's not good news for Ukrainians, but the good news is that finally, watching the Ukrainians start to lose and watching the United States lose interest in Ukraine has gotten the Europeans to take this much more seriously. It's gotten the Europeans to talk about a NATO pillar and spend not 2% of their defense GDP, but maybe 3% or more, which they wouldn't have done 6 months ago or 12 months ago. It looks at the Europeans just yesterday announcing that they will use the frozen assets of the Russians, will use the interest to start rebuilding Ukraine and supporting them militarily. 3 months ago, Europe wasn't going to do that. What's changed? Well, what's changed is that the situation for Ukraine is urgent. My last book was called The Power of Crisis. And I said sometimes you need a crisis that is big enough that it forces you to take conflict seriously. The Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. Nobody cared. They invaded Ukraine in 2014. Not enough people cared. They invaded Ukraine in 2022. What was the response? The response was NATO called the Ukrainian president and said, we'll send you a plane, we'll get you out, just like they did with Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan. And if the Ukrainian leader had done what NATO expected, he would have gotten out, Ukraine would have fallen. So the revealed preference is that the crisis wasn't big enough for NATO to take itself seriously. The crisis is now big enough for NATO to take itself seriously. And if the Europeans put that money in, even if Trump is president, he's going to say, look at the Europeans, now they're spending more. You know why? Because of me. He takes a victory lap. He's the guy that saved NATO. And you know what Macron says? Thank you, Mr. Trump. Right? That's what they say. Why? Because he's got the big stack at the poker table. They don't like him, but they're not stupid. Right? And so there is a level of that playing out.
The last